Hello and welcome. It's been a week of international disbelief at Russia's insistence in linking Ukraine to the Crocus concert mass shooting, despite all evidence pointing to Islamic State, including the group itself claiming responsibility. We'll look at Putin's motive and also the threat posed by ISIS-K in Europe.
This atrocity may be just a link in a whole series of attempts by those who have been at war with our country since 2014 by the hands of the neo-Nazi Kiev regime.
It was a week where the French principle of a secularism issue became a flashpoint once again. A head teacher resigning after receiving death threats for ordering pupils to remove their headscarves. The government suing a student for alleging the teacher assaulted her. We'll assess President Macron's so-called ruthless approach to extremism.
The state will always stand with these officials, those who are on the front line, faced with these breaches of secularism.
Ces atteintes à la laïcité.
And it was an unusually quiet week for royal trolls and conspiracy theorists in light of the announcement that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has cancer. King Charles, also undergoing treatment, delivered a pre-recorded Easter message. We ask whether it's the job of international media to report on social media storms and teacup conspiracies at all.
We need and benefit greatly from those who extend the hand of friendship to us, especially in a time of need.
I'm Gavin Lee. Welcome to The World This Week. With me in the studio from the press corps this week, Matthew Dalton, Paris, and Europe reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Matthew, a quick word before we start. Your colleague, Evan Gershkovich, it is a year this week that he's been, since he's been arrested now in a Russian prison. This is the headline of your newspaper today, saying Evan's story should be here. What's the latest on his condition, his sense of health and his mood?
Well, I think he's in good health. He's being treated well for a Russian prisoner. He's a high-profile prisoner. He is, I don't have personal kind of real-time information about how he's doing, but I think he's in good health, and I think his spirits are holding up. But of course, from our perspective, it's just a tragedy every day he's in prison. And so we know that he has been caught up in this geopolitical conflict between the United States and Russia. He was in Russia accredited by the Russian government as a journalist to report in Russia, and he had been living in Russia for a number of years. Moscow suddenly changed the rules of the game on him. They decided that they were going to try to use him, we reported, to trade for a Russian convict who has been convicted in a Western court by in a fair process by an independent court. And this is, what we think is that this person is a Russian hitman who's imprisoned in Germany for killing a Chechen opposition figure. And so it's just not fair. It's terrible what Russia is doing, but that's the game they're playing.
So essentially a pawn in a geopolitical bargaining chip for Putin. I saw your editor of your newspaper this week telling reporters it is by far the most dangerous time for journalists reporting abroad right now. Let's also bring in Ketavan Gurjistani, France 24's international affairs editor. Looking at your Twitter this week, something very interesting. Tell us about this. This is a school in France where the parents are teaching the children outside because of a teacher crisis. What's going on?
Exactly. This is actually, full disclosure, a friend of mine who's also a fellow journalist. It's a school in the 20th arrondissement in Paris. And for months now, they've had problems with having enough teachers for their children. And what you see there is my friend. One day, finally, they got there with other parents, and there were only 2 teachers for about 100 of these little children. And they decided to take matters into their own hands and to sort of do class on the street. It was also a way to sort of shock people in order to talk about a problem that is not specific to the 20th arrondissement, not specific to Paris, but really a widespread problem in France and in the French educational system, even more so when you talk about middle school or high school, this lack of teachers. In this specific case, 2 teachers for 100 students. They can't even have substitutes regularly. Now, following this, of course, and that's the luck that this school had, which is that there were a few parents who are journalists and who have the network to get this out there. And there was some movement. They got some substitutes who are coming now every day to fill in for those blanks. But 2 issues that some of the parents are pointing to is that they don't want to take substitutes away from other schools, which is probably what is happening. And most importantly, so far, at least for now as we speak, there is no long-term solution to this problem, whether it's in that school or in schools across France.
Ketevan, thank you. Great to have you both on board. Well, let's begin. On Monday, 4 men identified as being from Tajikistan were brought into a courtroom in Moscow charged with terrorism for the mass shooting at the Crocus Concert Hall this time last week, which left at least 140 people dead. The biggest attack in 2 decades in Russia. 3 suspects, you can see them bent double, marched into court, the other in a wheelchair, appearing only to be half conscious. Videos of interrogation sessions reportedly leaked by Russian security, showing at least one being given electric shocks. The branch of IS claiming responsibility, ISIS-K, Islamic State of the Khorasan province. This is the region they cover, covering Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and as you can see, parts of Central Asia. Then on Thursday, despite international security services from the US, UK, France, all pointing to ISIS-K, Russian investigators say they have evidence linking the attackers to Ukrainian nationalists. And Ukrainians provide the attackers, said Putin, with cash and cryptocurrencies.
This atrocity may be just a link in a whole series of attempts by those who have been at war with our country since 2014 by the hands of the neo-Nazi Kiev regime. And the Nazis, as we well know, have never hesitated to use the dirtiest and most inhumane means to achieve their goals.
There are 2 immediate issues arising here. Ketevan, the first, the fact that you have Kyiv claiming this is disinformation at its purest. What's your assessment? You've been covering this all week behind what Putin's thinking is here.
Well, look, the fact that Putin would use any possibility to sort of blame Ukraine and the West for something that happened in Russia is not a surprise to anyone who knows how this Russian system functions. And the reaction from the West, not just from Ukraine, has been just that. Yesterday, the National Security Council advisor at the White House, John Kirby, he said it was nonsense and propaganda, and they were sort of expecting it. This idea that he was trying in some way, in one way or another, to use Ukraine and the West as a scapegoat, even though the people that they've arrested have no direct ties with Ukraine or the West. But now it's more looking at the financing of this attack, and that maybe somehow the West was involved in operating this, and pointing to the fact that this is a sort of Western or Ukrainian destabilizing operation within Russia. So no real surprise from the West that Vladimir Putin would use this, but the Americans, the French, other Europeans, the Ukrainians really doubling down and saying that not only did ISIS-K claim responsibility for this, but every intel they have points to the fact that it is indeed their doing.
Which, Matthew, points us to the second issue here, ISIS-K. Are we looking at a re-emergence of an Islamic State threat to Europe, or has it never really gone away?
Well, I think if you talk to European security officials, they say that the threat is under control. They're still a target, but the capabilities of the group have been much degraded. They've lost the previous safe haven that they had, which was in Syria and Iraq. That has been largely disbanded.
The so-called caliphate that they had back
in about
2014.
Right, 2016, 2017. That is gone. So they say that, well, the threat is more from these kind of lone wolf figures, these people who are inspired by the Islamist propaganda that Islamic State puts on the internet. to conduct attacks. We've seen a number of those over the years, but nothing like the large-scale attacks that we saw in 2015 at the Bataclan, 2016 in Brussels, that really require that kind of base in Syria. They sent in militants, fighters with the refugee flows coming from the Syrian war, and that was how Europe was the target of this kind of large-scale attack, which Moscow now faces. However, you look at what's happening in Afghanistan, the Khorasan province. The United States has pulled out of Afghanistan. There's the Taliban, which is a kind of embattled government. They don't have potentially the capability to really fight Islamic State and control the territory of Afghanistan. So I think it's probably something that security services are going to have to think about, this problem, this threat of Afghanistan emerging as a new safe haven, like it was 20 years ago for al-Qaeda, which is why obviously 9/11 and why the United States went in there. So I think this is a potential new threat. It's something that, is Islamic State reconstituting its capabilities to conduct this kind of operation in Russia? That's what they did. Europe, potentially. I mean, it's if they can get to Moscow, why can't they get to Berlin or Paris?
Really interesting. Just some intel on this group. So 2015 was when the ISIS-K began, an offshoot of the Pakistan Taliban. Their numbers went down to about 1,500, 2,000 American airstrikes on Afghanistan, making a big difference in hitting the group. But their sort of rise, if you will, was this, if you both remember, that targeting of Kabul airport in the big escape when US troops left Afghanistan, ISIS-K behind it. And Ketavan, it's not just Moscow, but a number of European intelligence organisations, the French as well, saying that they've been thwarting some attacks ahead of the Olympics, for example.
Yes, because you mentioned Paris and Berlin, and of course, France and Germany are the two countries who are going to be holding major sporting events. The Germans are starting off with the football Euro, which it's going to last about a month. They've already decided to implement, when we get closer to the competition, border controls in Germany in order to prevent potentially anyone from coming in. The French also, of course, with the Olympics, are beefing up their security. They raised the terror threat to its highest level following the Moscow attack, but the Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, had some pretty specific words. He said that the Islamist threat is real, it's strong, and it has never weakened. So yes, they're raising the threat level because there was this attack in Moscow, but they've been sort of in the background, always being prepared because they know they're going to have the Olympics. And the head of the French Domestic Intelligence Agency just earlier this month was discussing this terrorist threat in front of a Senate commission. And she said that they will, these terrorists, whoever they are, try to use the Olympics to have an operation. The question is, will French authorities be ready to prevent any type of attacks? You've said it. There were at least 2 attacks that were prevented just this year alone. I think it was one in January and one in early March. And the French president saying that this specific group, ISIS-K, had actually tried to target France in the past few years.
Ketavan, which brings us on to another major development here in France this week. An incident at the Maurice Ravel School in Paris has drawn, while international attention, reignited a debate over French values of secularism and the treatment of the Muslim minority. What we know, according to the Paris prosecutor's office, a head teacher told 3 Muslim students to take off their headscarves this week. It's the rule: you cannot wear religious symbols or clothing in the classroom. 2 did. The other claimed there was an altercation and that she was assaulted. The head teacher received death threats online and resigned. Now the government's suing the student, alleging she's lying over the incident. Here's the Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal.
I have decided that the state will sue this young woman for slanderous accusation. This gives me the opportunity to reiterate that the state will always stand with these officials, those who are on the front line, faced with these breaches of secularism, these attempts of Islamist entryism into our education establishments.
There's been Islamist killings of 2 teachers in the past 4 years, and a year ago in Arras, after the stabbing of a teacher there, President Macron talked about a ruthless approach in cracking down on extremism. Has it worked? Well, not according to the opposition.
Une défaite de l'État sur aujourd'hui.
It's a defeat for the state in the face of the Islamist gangrene that is flourishing, the radicalization of a whole generation of young people by radical movements, the fact that we've allowed organizations close to the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist organizations to take root in our country.
Qui ont pied aujourd'hui sur le territoire français.
Chaque fois qu'un professeur
Every time a teacher leaves school because of death threats, it's a collective failure. This is serious. Death threats have no place anywhere.
nulle part.
Matthew, this is clearly a very emotive issue, difficult issue to cover too. What's your assessment on how the government is balancing this? I mean, it's not really heard of before, a government suing a student for defamation, is it?
Well, France views its schools as kind of like on the front line of teaching French Republican values, and one of the main French Republican values is laïcité. And I think, particularly after the death of Samuel Paty in 2020, when he was murdered by the Islamist extremists, the government and Macron took the line that they really had to be extremely firm in terms of making sure that those kind of values didn't make their way into the French into the French public. And we talked about what happened in 2015, 2016 when Islamic State attacked. A lot of those were French people who went to Syria, trained with Islamic State, that came back and attacked. And that was kind of a wake-up call for the government to say, look, we've got to make sure that these extremist values don't find their way into into schools and into the public. And so it's been a multi-year campaign to try and stamp this out. And I think this is another indication of where I think the French government across multiple parties is at right now.
Matthew, you mentioned the case of Samuel Paty, a teacher in Conflans-en-Orine, which is in the Val d'Oise, who showed essentially the Prophet Muhammad during a lesson. It was alleged that a girl had said that he was showing these images, and an Islamist from Normandy came and he was beheaded. Now, this is why it's such an emotive issue. Your sense at the moment, you listened to the opposition just a second ago, is that purely because we've got an election coming up at the European Parliament, or is there a sense of they're portraying the frustrations of people too?
I think it's a little bit of both. Obviously, when you're in an election year, there's always political use of things that go wrong. But to join your point on this idea of laïcité, it has always been the founding principle, one of the founding principles of the French École républicaine, the Republic school. And the issue now is that if you put aside some of the more extreme events, you talked about Samuel Paty, which was one of the most horrific incidents. These smaller types of incidents, like this altercation between the principal and the student, are something that is something that happens way more often. And you saw this discussion with the abaya, this long robe that mostly Muslim women wear, and there was a ban on wearing those in school. And I think there's also a movement away from just the idea of laïcité and whether that goes along with laïcité or not. There's also a sort of culture war, if you will, and we saw Marion Maréchal Le Pen from the far right. There is this idea of focusing mostly, of course, on Muslims. And so there is within the public this debate on how do you control and do you prevent this Islamist problematic from reaching the schools without alienating a part of the population that has Muslim beliefs and that lives in that community. And so you're seeing the far right, the far left, using this also to say, well, you're always targeting the Muslims, or you're not targeting enough if you're talking about the far right. So I think there are a lot of different elements who go into these debates in the schools. The idea and the principle of laïcité and how do you apply it in school. The political aspect, obviously, and this idea of the culture wars within France that is starting to build up.
Matthew, Ketevan right, this is really down to a more central issue of a culture war going on.
Well, I think it's a culture war that I think the government is trying to kind of wage. I think they really do see this the schools as being on the front line for reinforcing Republican values and this concept of laïcité. And so they're going to use, I mean, I just know that for my kids in school, they get a lot of this teaching. They have whole classes on it. I mean, particularly after Samuel Paty, they use that moment as a moment to really hammer home the point that you're not supposed to be you're supposed to be leaving your religion at the door. We're not, and we have to tolerate different points of view, even points of view that might offend one religion or another. All those things can be discussed. So this is something that I noticed in my own home, that it really was amplified after Samuel Paty, after his death.
Let's talk about something else that's been amplified to a huge degree in the UK, the annual royal message for Easter. Delivered as an audio recording this year, King Charles unable to attend the service in church and deliver the message in person in the midst of his cancer treatment. Here's an excerpt of what he said.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is for me a great sadness that I cannot be with you all today. The Maundy service has a very special place in my heart. We need and benefit greatly from those who extend the hand of friendship to us, especially in a time of need.
A week on from the announcement that the future Queen, Catherine, is also being treated for cancer, social media commentary, royal trolling, conspiracy theories have suddenly quietened. And a columnist in the Times, Matthew Said, describing the online royal conspiracies, saying that ultimately it was like a modern type of football hooliganism of a digital age, calling it grotesque and a selfish high for low-grade delinquency. So the question, what should international media do? When interest is so high, social media commentary is so dominant and frenzied like it was in the vacuum of information about Kate's whereabouts. Ketevan.
Well, it's a question that media organizations have been trying to answer for a while now, and it didn't start with the royals. It's just the latest example of that problem.
On steroids.
On steroids, definitely. But this idea of how do you treat fake news? Do you talk about it to explain that it is fake news, but at the same time, that means you're publicizing and broadcasting to a wider audience the existence of those conspiracy theories, fake newses? Or do you just put a lid on it, don't talk about it, not to give it more air, but then you're sort of being seen by some of these conspiracy theorists as trying to cover it up, maybe, and that feeds into the broader conspiracy, which is the mainstream organizations are trying to prevent us from knowing the truth. So it's sort of a cycle, a vicious cycle of if you damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Matthew, we've got about a minute left. I want to know your thought here. You give some treatment to it in a way that you check through, or you ignore it, and therefore, as Ketevan said, you don't give oxygen journalistically to it.
I think you largely ignore it. I think that's the right answer, unless in the rare exception when it's popped into the public sphere in a way that is so unavoidable that you have to cover it. But in a case like this, I look at the events of the last few weeks, and she had not been out in public for a while. She's a public figure. The royal family are all public. Exactly, they're all public figures, and so at some point, it's legitimate to ask the question of what's going on, and without resorting to speculation about various conspiracy theories that could be true or not, which they weren't.
Well, as the late Queen Elizabeth said, seeing is believing, and that's why they do royal tours. You don't see them since December,
right. Hence
there's this massive vacuum. And just briefly, how do you think the media, by and large, internationally, handled it?
Well, I think you should distinguish between the British media and the international media. I don't know how the British media handled it. I'm told probably not so well, but from our perspective, we didn't engage in repeating any kind of these absurd conspiracy theories, and I think that was largely true of media in France that I saw and American media as well. So I think that's the divide I would mention.
Matthew, thank you. Media storms and teacup conspiracies. Matthew Dalton from the Wall Street Journal and Ketavan Gurjistani, our international affairs editor. Thank you both. We'll be back at the same time next week for The World Next Week. See you then.